When the rescue ship finally reached Cape Sabine on June 22, 1884, the crew expected to find either a thriving scientific station or the graves of 25 American explorers. What they found instead was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 6 skeletal figures who barely looked human, surrounded by the remains of 19 men who had died of starvation in one of the most horrific survival ordeals in Arctic history. The survivors could barely speak. Their clothes hung like rags on frames so emaciated that rescuers initially couldn't believe these were the robust soldiers and scientists who had departed 3 years earlier. They weighed less than 100 pounds each, living skeletons who had somehow found the will to survive when 19 of their companions had died around them. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As rescuers explored the camp, they found evidence of choices that no human should ever have to make. Evidence that survival had required these men to cross moral boundaries that civilization had taught them never to cross. The Greely Expedition had begun in 1881 as a prestigious scientific mission, part of the first International Polar Year, with 25 carefully selected men tasked with establishing a weather station in the Arctic and conducting research that would advance human knowledge. It was supposed to be a routine 2-year assignment that would earn them recognition and scientific glory. Instead, it became a 3-year nightmare of abandonment, starvation, and survival choices that tested the very foundations of human morality and endurance. When supply ships failed to reach them, when their food ran out, when winter after winter trapped them in the Arctic darkness, these men faced the ultimate question: what are you willing to do to stay alive? Some chose to maintain their humanity at the cost of their lives. Others chose survival at the cost of their souls. All of them proved that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and that sometimes the greatest survival challenge isn't the environment, it's preserving who you are when everything depends on becoming someone else. Welcome back to Hold On, Survival Stories, where we uncover the most incredible and often disturbing tales of human endurance that history tried to hide. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most controversial survival stories ever documented. A story that challenges everything we think we know about human morality under extreme circumstances. Before we begin this difficult journey, grab your headphones and prepare yourself for a story that will test your assumptions about survival and human nature. We're about to witness the Greely Expedition, which began as prestigious scientific research and ended as one of the most morally complex survival ordeals in exploration history. If you're new to Hold On, Survival Stories, we specialize in bringing you the true accounts of people who faced circumstances so extreme that they had to make choices most of us can't imagine. These aren't sanitized adventure stories. They're raw, honest examinations of what humans become when survival is the only thing that matters. Today's story takes us to the Arctic in 1881, where 25 men embarked on what should have been a routine scientific mission. When supply ships failed to reach them, when their food ran out, when they faced 3 years of abandonment in one of Earth's most hostile environments, They discovered that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. This is the story of the Greely Expedition, where only 6 of 25 men survived, and where the price of survival was higher than anyone should ever have to pay. In the spring of 1881, First Lieutenant Adolphus Greely stood at the helm of what was considered one of the most prestigious scientific assignments of the era. At 37 years old, he was a career Army officer with experience in frontier communications, but no Arctic exploration background, a detail that would prove more significant than anyone realized. The Lady Franklin Bay Expedition was part of the first International Polar Year, an ambitious international scientific cooperation that involved multiple nations establishing research stations across the Arctic to conduct synchronized meteorological and magnetic observations. Greely's mission was to establish the northernmost American station at Fort Conger on Ellesmere Island, 81 degrees north latitude. The 25-man team assembled for this mission represented a carefully selected group of soldiers, scientists, and specialists. They included meteorologists, astronomers, naturalists, photographers, and support personnel who expected to spend 2 years in comfortable quarters conducting valuable research that would advance scientific knowledge and bring glory to American exploration. Fort Conger had been established by British explorers and offered substantial buildings, adequate shelter, and what appeared to be excellent facilities for Arctic research. The location provided access to geographic features of scientific interest while offering protection from the worst Arctic weather. It seemed like an ideal base for extended scientific operations. The supply plan for the expedition appeared comprehensive and well-organized. Ships would deliver provisions and equipment in 1882 and 1883, ensuring adequate food, fuel, and materials for the duration of their stay. If weather prevented resupply in any given year, cached supplies and careful rationing would sustain the party until the next season's delivery. The scientific equipment they carried was extensive and sophisticated, representing the latest advances in meteorological and magnetic observation instruments. Daily weather readings, astronomical observations, and natural history collections would contribute to international scientific databases and enhance understanding of polar climate patterns. Greely's leadership style was military and methodical, emphasizing discipline, routine, and careful attention to scientific protocols. He established daily schedules, work assignments, and procedures designed to maximize their scientific productivity while maintaining order and morale during their extended Arctic residence. The early months at Fort Conger proceeded exactly as planned. The men settled into comfortable routines, began their scientific observations, and explored the surrounding territory with enthusiasm and professional interest. Their research produced valuable data, while their living conditions remained civilized and organized. The first winter passed successfully, with adequate food, fuel, and shelter. The men maintained good health and spirits while continuing their scientific work throughout the long Arctic night. Their achievements during this period validated the expedition planning and suggested that their mission would be entirely successful. But the success of their first year created dangerous overconfidence about Arctic conditions and the reliability of supply operations. The summer of 1882 brought the first sign that their comfortable situation might not be permanent. The supply ship that was supposed to deliver provisions and mail arrived late and with reduced cargo due to ice conditions that had prevented normal navigation. While they received adequate supplies, the delay suggested potential problems with future resupply operations. Greely dismissed concerns about supply reliability, focusing instead on the scientific success of their mission and the valuable data they were collecting. His confidence in military logistics and official promises blinded him to the possibility that they might be abandoned in the Arctic if weather or other factors prevented ship operations. The second winter at Fort Conger passed comfortably, but with growing anxiety about the 1883 resupply mission that would determine whether they could complete their assignment or would need to evacuate earlier than planned. The psychological pressure of dependence on external support began to affect group morale and decision-making. As spring 1883 approached, the expedition faced a crucial decision point that would determine their fate. Official orders required them to remain at Fort Conger until relieved by supply ships, but alternative plans allowed for evacuation to predetermined locations if supply failed. The choice between following orders and ensuring survival would soon become a matter of life and death. The 25 men who had arrived as confident scientists and soldiers were about to discover that the Arctic cared nothing for their scientific mission, their military discipline, or their careful planning. They were about to learn that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about duty, loyalty, and human decency. The summer of 1883 arrived at Fort Conger with the usual optimism and anticipation that characterized resupply season. The 25 members of the Greely Expedition scanned the horizon daily for the ship that would bring fresh supplies, mail from home, and confirmation that their scientific mission was proceeding according to plan. But as the weeks passed and no vessel appeared, optimism gave way to anxiety, then to the terrible realization that they had been abandoned in the Arctic. Lieutenant Greely faced an impossible decision that would determine the fate of every man under his command. Official orders required him to remain at Fort Conger until relieved by supply ships, but alternative instructions provided for evacuation to Cape Sabine if resupply failed by a specific date. Following orders meant staying in relative comfort, but risking permanent abandonment. Evacuating meant leaving their established base for an uncertain journey to a location with minimal supplies. The debate over whether to stay or go consumed the expedition as summer turned to autumn without any sign of rescue ships. Some men argued for remaining at Fort Conger, where they had adequate shelter and some remaining supplies. Others advocated for evacuation to Cape Sabine, where relief ships might eventually find them, even though the journey would be dangerous and the destination offered little comfort. Greely ultimately chose evacuation, a decision that seemed reasonable given their circumstances, but would prove catastrophically wrong. On August 9, 1883, the 25 men abandoned Fort Conger and began what they expected to be a difficult but manageable journey to Cape Sabine, 250 miles to the south. They carried limited supplies, believing they would find cached provisions at their destination. The evacuation journey was far more dangerous and difficult than anyone had anticipated. Ice conditions, weather, and equipment failures turned what should have been a straightforward boat trip into a desperate struggle for survival. The men were forced to abandon much of their equipment and supplies while fighting through conditions that challenged their seamanship and endurance. When they finally reached Cape Sabine in late October 1883, they found a desolate, wind-swept location that offered virtually no shelter or resources. The supply caches they had expected to find were either non-existent or completely inadequate for 25 men facing an Arctic winter. They had traded the comfort of Fort Conger for a survival situation that would test every aspect of their endurance. The shelter they constructed at Cape Sabine was a crude stone and canvas structure that provided minimal protection from Arctic storms. 25 men crowded into a space barely adequate for half their number, with no privacy, inadequate ventilation, and constant exposure to cold that penetrated their improvised walls. Food supplies were critically inadequate from the moment they arrived at Cape Sabine. The provisions they had carried from Fort Conger, combined with whatever cached supplies they could locate, would not sustain 25 men through a complete Arctic winter. Rationing became immediate and severe, with portions that barely sustained life while failing to provide adequate nutrition for men facing extreme cold. The psychological impact of their situation was devastating, as the men realized they had voluntarily left relative safety for what might become a death trap. The decision to evacuate Fort Conger, which had seemed prudent, now appeared to have condemned them to starvation in one of the most desolate places on Earth. Medical problems began almost immediately, as inadequate food and harsh living conditions weakened everyone's health. Scurvy appeared within weeks, while frostbite, infections, and other cold-related injuries created medical emergencies that they lacked resources to treat effectively. The daily routine at Cape Sabine became a grim struggle to maintain basic survival while hoping for rescue that might never come. Food distribution became the focus of everyone's attention, with careful measurement of portions that grew smaller as supplies dwindled and hope for rescue faded. Discipline and morale deteriorated as hunger and despair affected everyone's judgment and emotional stability. Arguments broke out over food allocation, work assignments, and leadership decisions, threatening the cooperation that was essential for group survival. By spring 1884, it became clear that no rescue would arrive before their food was completely exhausted. The men faced the prospect of slow starvation unless they could find alternative sources of nutrition, or unless rescue arrived in time to prevent complete catastrophe. The 25 men who had begun as a confident scientific expedition were now reduced to a desperate survival situation that would test not just their physical endurance, but their fundamental humanity. The choices they would be forced to make in the coming months would challenge every moral and ethical principle they had been taught to value. As winter deepened and their supplies continued to dwindle, the Greely Expedition members began to understand that survival might require them to make decisions that no civilized person should ever have to contemplate. Their transformation from scientists to survivors was about to become complete, with consequences that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. By February 1884, the 25 men at Cape Sabine had entered a state of starvation so severe that their bodies were consuming themselves to stay alive. The daily food ration had been reduced to a handful of breadcrumbs and a thin soup made from whatever organic matter they could find: seaweed, leather, and the boiled bones of animals they'd eaten months earlier. Lieutenant Greely watched his men transform from healthy soldiers and scientists into walking skeletons whose clothes hung loose on frames that had lost 40, 50, even 60 pounds. Their faces became gaunt masks, their eyes sunken deep in their sockets, their movements slow and deliberate as they conserved every precious calorie for basic survival. The medical condition of the expedition members was deteriorating beyond anything that military medicine had prepared them to handle. Scurvy was widespread, causing teeth to fall out, old wounds to reopen, and joints to swell painfully. But worse than scurvy was the simple fact of starvation. Their bodies were systematically shutting down as vital organs competed for the minimal nutrition available. Sleep became nearly impossible as hunger gnawed constantly at their empty stomachs. The men would lie awake for hours in their crowded shelter, listening to each other's labored breathing and wondering who would be the next to die. The sound of someone's breathing stopping during the night became a familiar horror that no one discussed but everyone feared. The deaths began in March 1884, when the weakest men could no longer sustain the basic biological functions necessary for life. Private Henry Biederbick was the first to die, followed quickly by others whose bodies had reached the absolute limits of human endurance. Each death was both a tragedy and a relief, one less mouth to feed, one more blanket for the living. But the deaths also presented the survivors with a moral dilemma that none of them had been prepared to face. In their extreme hunger, surrounded by the bodies of their dead companions, some of the men began to consider the unthinkable, using the flesh of the dead to sustain the living. It was a choice that violated every principle of civilized behavior, but it was also potentially the difference between survival and death. The first instances of cannibalism occurred quietly, without official sanction or group discussion. Starving men, driven beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior by extreme hunger, began to consume human flesh when they thought no one was observing. It was survival reduced to its most primitive essence, the biological imperative to live overriding moral and social constraints. Lieutenant Greely found himself facing the most difficult leadership challenge any military officer has ever confronted. Should he officially sanction cannibalism as a survival measure, or should he maintain military discipline and civilized behavior, even if it meant everyone would die? His decision would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of people the survivors would become. The psychological transformation that accompanied physical starvation was as devastating as the hunger itself. Men who had been colleagues, friends, and fellow professionals began to view each other as potential sources of food. Trust and cooperation deteriorated as survival instincts overwhelmed social bonds and military discipline. Some members of the expedition refused to participate in cannibalism regardless of the consequences, maintaining their moral principles even as they weakened toward death. Others embraced it as necessary for survival, arguing that the dead could still serve their living companions by providing the nutrition needed to sustain life until rescue arrived. The quality of leadership during this period became crucial for determining who survived and who died. Greely's decisions about food distribution, work assignments, and discipline affected everyone's chances of survival. But his authority was increasingly challenged by men whose judgment was impaired by starvation and desperation. Arguments over food became violent as rational thought gave way to survival desperation. Men who had worked together professionally for years began to steal from each other, hoard supplies, and make accusations about unfair treatment that reflected the breakdown of civilized behavior under extreme stress. The shelter itself became a nightmare of disease, death, and moral compromise. 25 men had been reduced to fewer than 10 survivors, crowded together with the bodies of their dead companions in a space that reeked of death, human waste, and the cooking of human flesh. It was a scene from hell that challenged every assumption about human dignity and civilized behavior. Religious faith provided comfort for some, but created additional moral anguish for others who struggled to reconcile their survival choices with their spiritual beliefs. The question of whether God would forgive cannibalism for survival purposes became a source of intense debate and personal torment among men who had been raised to believe in absolute moral standards. As spring 1884 approached, fewer than 10 men remained alive, and even they were so weakened by starvation and disease that survival seemed impossible. Their bodies had adapted to operating on minimal nutrition, but they had also reached the biological limits of human endurance. Without rescue, within weeks, even the survivors would die. The men who remained alive carried with them not just the physical devastation of extreme starvation, but the psychological burden of choices that no human being should ever have to make. They had survived by crossing moral boundaries that civilization had taught them never to cross, and they would have to live with those choices for the rest of their lives. As rescue ships prepared to depart for the Arctic in June 1884, they had no idea they were racing to save not just lives, but souls, to rescue men who had been forced to become something other than human in order to remain alive. On June 22, 1884, the steamships Thetis and Bear approached Cape Sabine, carrying the rescue expedition that had been organized after news of the Greely party's abandonment reached Washington. The rescuers expected to find either a functioning scientific station or a camp of graves, but they were unprepared for the horror that actually awaited them on that desolate Arctic shore. Commander Winfield Scott Schley, leading the rescue operation, was an experienced naval officer who had participated in previous Arctic expeditions. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the scene that greeted him as his boats approached the beach at Cape Sabine. Through his binoculars, he could see what appeared to be moving scarecrows, human figures so emaciated they barely looked alive. The first rescuer to reach the survivors was Navy surgeon Edward Ned Coldwell, whose medical training had taught him to maintain professional composure under difficult circumstances. But when he saw the 6 skeletal figures who comprised the expedition's survivors, he struggled to control his emotions and later wrote that they looked more like animated corpses than living human beings. Commander Greely, the expedition commander, weighed less than 100 pounds when rescued, approximately half his original body weight. He could barely speak, his voice reduced to a whisper, and he was unable to stand without assistance. The other 5 survivors were in similar condition, their bodies so wasted by starvation that rescuers initially doubted they could survive the voyage home. The campsite itself presented a scene of unimaginable horror that would haunt the rescuers for the rest of their lives. The bodies of 19 dead expedition members lay scattered around the crude shelter, some partially buried in shallow graves, others preserved by the Arctic cold in grotesque positions that revealed the manner of their deaths. But the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. As rescuers explored the camp and examined the survivors' living conditions, they found unmistakable evidence of cannibalism. Human bones that had been cracked for marrow, flesh that had been systematically removed from corpses, and cooking implements that revealed how the dead had been processed for food. The medical examination of the survivors revealed the full extent of their ordeal. Beyond extreme weight loss, they suffered from advanced scurvy, frostbite injuries, and various infections that had weakened their immune systems. Several had lost fingers and toes to frostbite, while all showed the characteristic symptoms of prolonged vitamin deficiency. Dr. Coldwell's medical notes documented not just physical condition, but psychological state, recording that the survivors exhibited signs of extreme trauma and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They spoke in whispers, seemed frightened of their rescuers, and showed behavioral patterns consistent with prolonged extreme stress. The immediate challenge facing the rescue team was determining whether the survivors were physically capable of surviving the journey back to civilization. Their condition was so severe that the shock of rescue itself, combined with sudden changes in diet and environment, could prove fatal to bodies that had adapted to near-starvation conditions. The process of evacuation required careful medical management to prevent the survivors from being killed by their own rescue. Feeding had to be gradual and carefully monitored, while their weakened bodies needed time to adjust to the idea that their ordeal was finally over and adequate food was available. The questioning of survivors about their experience revealed the full scope of their survival choices, including the cannibalism that had kept some of them alive during the final months. These revelations created a moral and public relations crisis for the rescue expedition and the U.S. government. The decision of what to do with the evidence of cannibalism became a diplomatic and ethical dilemma. The rescuers were obligated to document their findings, but also recognized that public knowledge of the survivors' actions could destroy their reputations and traumatize their families. Personal effects and scientific records saved from the camp provided evidence of the expedition's original scientific mission and the gradual deterioration of conditions that had led to their desperate situation. The contrast between their initial optimism and final desperation was documented in journals and letters that survivors had maintained even during their darkest periods. The bodies of the dead presented logistical and emotional challenges for the rescue operation. Families deserved to have their loved ones returned for proper burial, but the condition of the remains and evidence of cannibalism complicated identification and created questions about what families should be told about their relatives' deaths. The news of the rescue created international sensation when it reached civilization. The story of 6 survivors from 25-man expedition captured public attention, but early reports carefully avoided details about the cannibalism and focused on the heroic aspects of their survival and rescue. As the rescue ships departed Cape Sabine, carrying their precious cargo of survivors, they also carried one of the most morally complex survival stories in exploration history. The 6 men who had lived were heroes who had endured imaginable hardships, but they were also men who had been forced to make choices that challenged fundamental assumptions about human morality and civilized behavior. The voyage home would provide time for the survivors to begin processing their experience and preparing for their return to a world that would celebrate their survival while struggling to understand the price they had paid for staying alive. The voyage from Cape Sabine to New York aboard the rescue ships provided the first opportunity for the 6 Greely Expedition survivors to begin processing 3 years of trauma, while preparing to face a world that would simultaneously celebrate their endurance and judge their survival choices. Dr. Edward Coldwell worked tirelessly during the journey to restore the survivors' physical health while also providing psychological support for men whose minds had been as damaged as their bodies by their Arctic ordeal. His medical notes documented not just their remarkable physical recovery, but also their struggles with guilt, shame, and memories that would never fade. Lieutenant Greely faced the additional burden of command responsibility for the 19 men who had died under his leadership. As expedition commander, he carried guilt not just for his own survival choices, but for decisions that had affected everyone's fate, from the evacuation of Fort Conger to the rationing policies that had determined who received food and who went without. The survivors found themselves grappling with survivor's guilt that was complicated by the knowledge that their lives had been sustained partly by consuming the flesh of their dead companions. They had to reconcile their gratitude for being alive with the horror of what they had been forced to do to survive. Media attention intensified as news of their rescue reached civilization, but early reports focused on their heroic endurance while carefully avoiding details about the cannibalism that had kept them alive. The survivors quickly learned that their full story was considered too disturbing for public consumption, and that their survival would be celebrated only if the darkest details remained secret. The psychological challenges of readjusting to civilization were enormous for men who had lived at the edge of human experience for 3 years. Normal social interactions, abundant food, and comfortable living conditions seemed almost surreal after their prolonged ordeal in conditions that had tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Family reunions were emotionally complex events that combined joy at survival with grief for the dead and trauma from experiences that could not be fully shared with people who had never faced such extreme circumstances. The survivors found themselves grappling with survivor's guilt that was complicated by the knowledge that their lives had been sustained partly by consuming the flesh of their dead companions. They had to reconcile their gratitude for being alive with the horror of what they had been forced to do to survive. The official investigation into the expedition's failure and the circumstances of the deaths created additional stress for survivors who had to relive their worst experiences while defending decisions that had been made under impossible circumstances. Military and civilian authorities struggled to balance recognition of heroic survival with concern about public reaction to cannibalism. Public speaking engagements and media interviews became sources of both income and torment for the survivors, who found themselves repeatedly asked to recount experiences that they would have preferred to forget. The public's fascination with their story created pressure to share details that were psychologically painful to discuss. The scientific results of the expedition, which had been its original purpose, were overshadowed by the survival story, but proved valuable for meteorological and geographical research. The data collected during their 3 years in the Arctic contributed to international scientific knowledge despite the tragic human cost of obtaining it. Medical studies of the survivors provided insights into human adaptation to extreme starvation and the physical effects of prolonged malnutrition. Their recovery patterns and long-term health effects contributed to understanding of survival physiology and the treatment of starvation victims. Legal questions arose about the cannibalism and whether any laws had been violated by the survivors' actions. Military and civilian authorities ultimately concluded that extreme necessity had justified their choices, but the legal precedent established by their case influenced subsequent discussions about survival ethics. The financial support provided to survivors and families of the dead reflected recognition of their sacrifice, while also serving to maintain their cooperation with official efforts to control public information about the expedition's darkest aspects. Government pensions and private donations provided security, but also created obligations to present their story in approved ways. Religious counseling became important for survivors who struggled to reconcile their survival choices with their spiritual beliefs. Military chaplains and civilian clergy worked to help them find peace with actions that had violated fundamental moral teachings but had been necessary for survival. The long-term psychological effects of their ordeal affected the survivors for decades after their rescue.
Several suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, while others found that their experience had given them perspectives on life and death that isolated them from normal social relationships. Career challenges arose for military survivors whose survival choices raised questions about their fitness for continued service. While officially exonerated for their actions, some found their advancement opportunities limited by commanders who were uncomfortable with their history. The contrast between public celebration of their heroic survival and private knowledge of the moral compromises they had made created psychological burdens that several survivors carried for the rest of their lives. They were simultaneously heroes and men who had been forced to abandon civilized behavior to stay alive. As the years passed, the survivors developed different approaches to managing their memories and their public image. Some spoke openly about their experience and its lessons, while others preferred privacy and tried to build new lives that weren't defined by their Arctic ordeal. The 6 men who returned from Cape Sabine had proven that human beings could survive circumstances that exceeded normal limits of endurance. But they had also learned that survival sometimes requires moral choices that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and civilized behavior.
The return of the Greely Expedition survivors forced American society and the international exploration community to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of survival, the limits of human morality, and the price that individuals and families should be expected to pay for scientific advancement and national prestige. The official government report on the expedition carefully documented the heroic aspects of their survival, while minimizing details about the cannibalism that had sustained the final survivors. This selective reporting reflected both sensitivity to families and concern about public reaction to actions that violated fundamental social taboos. Medical and scientific analysis of the expedition's experience contributed to understanding of human starvation, Arctic survival, and group psychology under extreme stress. The detailed records maintained by expedition members provided unprecedented documentation of the physical and psychological effects of prolonged survival in extreme conditions. The ethical debates generated by the expedition's survival choices influenced discussions about moral philosophy, emergency ethics, and the circumstances under which normal moral constraints might be suspended in favor of survival necessity. These debates continued for decades and established legal and ethical precedents. Military analysis of the expedition focused on leadership lessons, logistics failures, and decision-making under extreme pressure. The experience influenced Arctic expedition planning and emergency procedures, while raising questions about the adequacy of military training for extreme survival situations. Public reaction to the expedition's story was complex and reflected broader social attitudes about heroism, survival, and moral compromise. While the survivors were generally treated as heroes, there was also underlying discomfort with their survival choices that affected their long-term social acceptance. The families of the 19 men who died struggled with complex grief that was complicated by questions about how their loved ones had died and whether their deaths had been necessary. The knowledge that some of the dead had been consumed by survivors added traumatic elements to their mourning process. International comparisons with other Arctic expeditions raised questions about American expedition planning and leadership compared to British, Norwegian, and other national approaches to polar exploration. The high casualty rate of the Greely expedition contrasted unfavorably with other contemporary Arctic missions. The scientific value of the expedition's research was eventually recognized and incorporated into international databases.
but the human cost raised questions about whether any scientific knowledge justified such loss of life. The balance between research goals and personnel safety became subjects of ongoing debate. Long-term studies of the survivors provided insights into the psychological effects of extreme trauma and moral injury. Several survivors struggled with mental health issues for decades, while others found that their experience had given them unique perspectives on life that they valued despite their trauma. The expedition's legacy influenced subsequent Arctic exploration through improved safety protocols, better emergency planning, and more realistic assessment of risks and resource requirements. The lessons learned from the Greely disaster contributed to safer and more successful future expeditions. Educational institutions used the Greely expedition as a case study in leadership, ethics, and survival psychology. Military academies, medical schools, and business programs analyzed the expedition's successes and failures to extract lessons applicable to various fields. The expedition's impact on families extended across generations, as children and grandchildren of expedition members dealt with family histories that included both heroic survival and morally complex choices. The psychological effects of the expedition affected family dynamics for decades. More literary and artistic works inspired by the expedition explored themes of survival, moral compromise, and the limits of human endurance. Books, articles, and dramatic works helped process the expedition's complex legacy while educating broader audiences about its lessons. Modern psychological analysis of the expedition, using contemporary understanding of trauma, stress responses, and group dynamics, has provided new insights into the factors that determined who survived and who died. These analyses have influenced military training, emergency response, and survival education. The expedition's contribution to scientific knowledge about Arctic climate, geography, and environmental conditions proved valuable for future research and exploration. The meteorological data collected during their 3 years in the Arctic advanced understanding of polar weather patterns. The debate over whether the expedition should be remembered as a heroic survival story or a cautionary tale about poor planning continues among historians and exploration experts. The complex legacy defies simple categorization and continues to generate discussion about risk, leadership, and human limits. The 6 survivors who returned from Cape Sabine had proven that human beings could endure circumstances that seemed impossible to survive. But they had also demonstrated that survival sometimes requires moral compromises that challenge fundamental assumptions about human dignity and civilized behavior. Their legacy includes both the scientific knowledge they helped gather and the difficult questions they raised about the price of survival and the limits of human morality when everything depends on staying alive. The Greely Expedition stands as one of the most complex and morally challenging survival stories in human history. Most importantly, their experience reminds us that survival is not just about physical endurance, but about the psychological and moral challenges of maintaining humanity under circumstances that seem designed to destroy everything that makes us human. Sometimes, the greatest survival challenge is not staying alive. It's remaining human while doing whatever is necessary to live.
And that's the story of the Greely Expedition survivors. 6 men who lived through one of the most morally complex survival ordeals in human history. This story is different from the others we've covered on Hold On, survival stories. And I'll be honest with you, it's been difficult to tell. We've looked at incredible feats of endurance, brilliant navigation, heroic leadership under pressure. But the Greely Expedition forces us to confront something much more uncomfortable. What happens to human morality when survival is the only thing that matters? 25 men embarked on what should have been a routine scientific mission. When supply ships failed to reach them, when their food ran out, when they faced 3 years of abandonment in the Arctic, they were forced to make choices that no human being should ever have to make. Only 6 survived, and their survival came at a price that haunts us even today. The cannibalism that kept some of them alive violates every moral principle we're taught to value. But here's the question that this story forces us to face. What would you do if you were starving to death, surrounded by the bodies of your dead companions, and human flesh was the only thing standing between you and certain death? It's easy to judge from the comfort of our modern lives, but these were good men, soldiers, scientists, professionals who had been raised with the same moral values we have. They didn't choose to become cannibals. Extreme circumstances forced them to choose between maintaining their moral purity and staying alive. What gets me most about this story is how it shows that the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than any of us want to believe. These men didn't become monsters overnight. It was a gradual process, first compromising on small things, then bigger things, until they were doing things that would have horrified their former selves. But here's what I find remarkable. Even in those horrible circumstances, some of the men chose to maintain their moral principles even if it meant death. They chose to die as humans rather than live by abandoning their humanity. That takes a kind of courage that's almost impossible to comprehend. And Lieutenant Greely? He had to make leadership decisions that no leader should ever face, deciding who got food and who didn't, whether to officially sanction cannibalism, how to maintain discipline when his men were literally eating their dead companions. Those are impossible choices, but he had to make them. The 6 survivors proved that human beings can endure absolutely anything if they're determined enough to live. But they also showed us that survival sometimes comes at costs that are higher than death itself. They lived, but they had to carry the weight of their survival choices for the rest of their lives. So here's my question for you. Where do you draw the line between survival and humanity? What moral principles are you willing to abandon to stay alive, and which ones would you die to preserve? Because the Greely survivors teach us that sometimes staying alive means becoming someone you never thought you could become. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. This is a difficult story that raises uncomfortable questions. What do you think about the survivors' choices? Have you ever faced situations where survival required moral compromises? And how do we balance judgment against understanding for people who faced impossible circumstances? If this challenging story made you think about survival and human nature in new ways, please hit that like button. And make sure you're subscribed to Hold On, Survival Stories, with notifications on. We explore the full spectrum of human endurance, including the stories that force us to confront difficult truths about survival and human nature. Coming up, we have more survival stories that will challenge your assumptions and show you the incredible and sometimes disturbing things humans are capable of when everything depends on staying alive. Until next time, remember the lesson of the Greely Expedition. Survival isn't just about physical endurance. Sometimes the hardest part of staying alive is deciding what parts of yourself you're willing to sacrifice and which parts you'll protect even if it costs you everything. This has been Hold On, Survival Stories. Thanks for joining me on this difficult but important journey into the darkest corners of human survival, and I'll see you in the next one.